Yes, I work for OJPC. Fortitude is politically correct, however you want to remember it. And the only reason I had the correct bill is because there's another wonderful institution in our community called IJPC, Interfaith Justice and Peace.
Intercommunity Justice and Peace.
Thank you. Wonderful people. I talked to Sister Alice there many times and collaborated on some things. But we're not them, we're OJPC. And yes, I eat, sleep, drink, and breathe the new Jim Crow, much to the detriment of my health. OJPC started many years ago, but this is actually a very auspicious day during this conversation because today marks exactly 10 years since OJPC got involved on actually addressing and tackling the after effects of incarceration. OJPC for a long time was a prisoner rights law office. If people here know Al Gerhardstein, he's godfather of civil rights around here. He's a really wonderful leader. Al started our office to meet the needs of incarcerated people, and we did a lot of litigation around that and still do. But it was exactly 10 years ago this month, perhaps this day if I'm not mistaken, that we started our first outreach legal clinic at the Freestore Foodbank to reach out to people who used to be in prison or just who have an old criminal record. And the idea was first to serve, and second to listen to patterns. What are all the big patterns and issues going on in that community of people who have old criminal records? How are they excluded? How can we remedy those? And sometimes it's one by one individual service, and then our office is always eager to find systemic solutions through litigation or through policy reform of different kinds, going to city council or city hall, going to the state legislature, the governor's office, trying to change the whole system. So that's how OJBC works and what we've been doing for 10 years. Today is actually, we actually have an anniversary celebration tonight. I'm happy to tell everybody about that. The new Jim Crow. A lot of people read this book. Some, yeah. Okay.
Started to.
Started to, great. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It has, the phrase, the new Jim Crow, has become almost atmospheric. It's sort of caught on. People just say it and they almost know what you're talking about. Some people don't, but there's a lot more that do. So thanks to this book, I can't thank Michelle Alexander enough for writing this book because it very well captured what I've been seeing and working on and living and serving people in this realm for many, many years. So the idea, the general gist of her book is that there was slavery, and then after slavery, actually there's sort of this interregnum, the convict leasing system. I don't know if you know that. There's a whole great book on that, written by a very conservative Wall Street Journal reporter called Slavery by Another Name, which is about after slavery, the convict leasing system was, oh my gosh, there's all these black people running around the South. What are we going to do? I know, we'll use the criminal justice system, lock them up, and then lease them out to the cotton industry was decimated. They didn't have enough workers to pick cotton anymore, and they were trying in the South was way behind on the Industrial Revolution. The North was way ahead of the game, and so they had to invent foundries and invent steel mills and all this other, well, not steel mills, but iron foundries at least, and other kinds of heavy industry. And they would lock up primarily African American people for incredibly petty offenses, and then lease them back out to these industries to work for to get paid. They'd be horrid conditions, in some ways it was even more. If you can believe this, there was some perspectives it was even more hellish than slavery itself, because not that there's any justification for it, but there was actually some slight economic motivation for a slave owner to treat his or her slaves somewhat kindly because they had to keep using them and it cost more to get them. Where the convict leasing system, you could expend a person's life to death and just get a new one the next day, and it would just be a flat cost. So it was extremely hellish experience, that convict leasing system. So that happened for a while, and then that fell apart as the injustice of it became known and people became aware more of it. It's the shining of bright light by advocates, happens. And so then okay, now we can't control these people this way and economically take advantage of them. So the Jim Crow comes around. And Jim Crow was this era from the early 1900s through the 60s or so, where we have the explicit racial segregation laws. And we all know what those were like. I don't have to give you a deep history lesson on that, but that's what this, in terms of big eras of racial control, systems of racial control, and that's basically the thesis of the book, that there is 4 big eras of racial control in America. Slavery, the convict leasing era, and which sort of blended and sort of overlapped with Jim Crow itself, which was just illegalizing being black, or separating, keeping people separate and demoting and denigrating people of color. And of course, then we have the civil rights movement of the 60s, and a lot of things change, and a lot of things get struck down. We have the Civil Rights Act, all these big Supreme Court cases, Brown versus Board, and things like that. Monumental shifts in law and society that say that's not acceptable. We can't accept that. We have to be race neutral. We have to be racially blind, and things are going to be all great. We're going to achieve racial equality at some point. No, what her thesis is that after the sort of disarray, when each of these systems falls apart, there's always a sort of season of disarray, of like, oh my God, what are we going to do? All these black people are running around with thinking they are equal human beings. We have to come up with a new system. This is as evil as it gets, but that's the thesis of the book, is that underlying a lot of these choices is that kind of fear. So, the choices that are made in the criminal justice system, in her idea, is that those become the new system of racial control. And one of the interesting things you can market in the 70s, it was in about 76, I think. There's a really famous, one of the kind of godfathers of criminology, researcher. He's in his 90s, I think, and he's brilliant. His name's Alfred Bloomstein. And he wrote this article, he was younger in his career, in the 70s, and it was something like the theory of the stability of incarceration rates. And he mapped out from when they had statistics from like the early teens of America, 19 teens, through, at that point, 76, I think, is when his paper was published. And while the population grew, the rate, per 100,000 people incarcerated was relatively flat. It kind of was this bumpy little line that went like this. And so he publishes this paper in 1976. And I love to map this out because I wish I had a chart to show you. But in 1977, the word war on drugs was first uttered in the Nixon administration in an Oval Office meeting. And from that point, you can watch as the prison rate grows, and then the number of people incarcerated. So we've had this tremendous explosion all across the country and in Ohio of people incarcerated. And it started with the war on drugs. That's the prime driver of it. And the rates of people getting incarcerated is dramatically weighted on people of color. And then she does, what else is good in this book, is she does a very good job of answering some of the obvious questions. Well, do black people use drugs more? No. There's lots of research from sociologists and others to show that the rate of illegal drug use is the same. In fact, it's probably a little higher in higher educated white communities. So she kind of knocks that down. And then she says, well, is illegal drug use happening more visibly in African-American communities? No. And she has all this sociological and environmental, anthropological research to show all that. It is choices that get made in policing and in prosecution about where to invest resources. When you say that the choices are made to do more policing, more prosecution, and longer prosecution, focused on communities primarily where low-income African-American people live, then surprisingly, not surprisingly, you end up locking up more of them for longer periods of time. And then once they're in front of court, the choices that get made by judges, and are invariably longer, by the averages are always longer sentences, more likely to get incarcerated, first of all, for a drug offense, and then once you are incarcerated, the sentence is always longer. The averages are always higher for people of color. And what's interesting is that she's trying to paint a really clear picture of what institutional racism looks like. Sometimes her book is really hard to swallow for people because they want to say, there's this knee-jerk reaction, I'm not racist. And what she's trying to point out is that you were born into a century, you were born into a series of decades of your life where all the assumptions about who the criminal justice system falls on, who's defined as criminal, who's depicted in the news media and the print and in the TV and elsewhere as criminal, as dangerous, as scary, all of that is fed into you by osmosis from the day you opened your eyes. And so that choices get made not by conscious necessarily animus. I don't like, like the governor of Alabama, whose name just slipped out of my head. The famous governor in Alabama, George Wallace. The George Wallace, or the sheriff who's fire hosing kids. Like that's active, above the line, tip of the iceberg, explicit, extreme racism. And what she's saying is that by osmosis, our institutions have built up rules and assumptions. Sometimes just habits of like, well, this is where we need to invest police resources on this kind of crime in these kinds of neighborhoods, that we end up slowly the slow accretion of all these little assumptions builds up to severe racial disparity. Even if you can't, it would be like a game of whack-a-mole to try to find the one actor who's racist in that system. There is no individual one actor who's the racist actor in the system. It is the whole system that has become embedded with this. So that's this book, and the Jim Crow part of it is the employment barriers that and voting to a certain extent.